Have you ever felt like the world moved on and forgot the weight you once carried? For those of us who've built a life in silence, kept our promises without applause, this story will feel personal. When Chuck Norris walked into a quiet town hall, no one expected what followed. Not noise, not force, just presence. And the power of being remembered. If you've ever been overlooked, stay with us. This isn't just his story, it might be yours too. Drop a comment if it resonates. Like and subscribe for more stories that speak where words often fail. It was a crisp autumn morning in Brighton Hollow, the kind where the light filters through amber leaves just enough to make the sidewalks look golden. The kind of morning that makes you pause, take a deeper breath and remember things you thought you'd forgotten. The air was still, except for a few gusts of wind that stirred the flag outside the old town hall. Chuck Norris stood at the base of the courthouse steps, holding a plain manila folder in one hand and a canvas bag slung across his shoulder. He looked up at the building, quietly. It wasn't his first time seeing it, but it was the first time he'd walked through those doors in over 30 years. The building hadn't changed much, maybe a fresh coat of paint here and there, but the bones were the same. He adjusted the collar of his coat, not out of vanity, but because the wind had started to bite. His movements were slow, but not uncertain. Age had taken none of his presence. He moved like a man who never gave a piece of himself away unless he meant to. Inside the town hall, the lobby was already buzzing with the quiet rhythm of a typical Wednesday. Phones rang behind desks. A few residents filled out paperwork near the permit office. Someone coughed near the water cooler. No one noticed the man who stepped through the front door. Chuck made his way across the room with quiet certainty. He walked like a man who had long since made peace with himself, like he had nothing left to prove to anyone. But he still carried purpose in his stride. He stopped at the front desk, where a young man with short sleeves and a nameplate that read Kellen looked up from his keyboard. Chuck gave a polite nod and placed the folder on the counter. He explained that he was there to confirm land use paperwork for a lot just outside town, Parcel 17, North Ridge. The folder contained the original title documents, an old notarized letter, and a signed community proposal. All of it neatly arranged, nothing extravagant, just facts. Kellen looked at the folder like it had been fished out of a time capsule. He thumbed through the pages, squinted at the handwriting, and furrowed his brow at the date in the corner, 1984. His expression shifted from neutral to faintly amused. He tapped a few keys and frowned. He told Chuck the property ID wasn't in the digital database, said it might have been archived or reassigned when the county lines were redrawn in the early 2000s. He asked if Chuck had any newer documentation, something scanned, verified, uploaded. Chuck replied, calm as ever, that he didn't. Just what he'd brought. It was what they gave him, and it had never been questioned. Not until now. Kellen gave a half smile, the kind people use when they don't quite believe you, but don't want to say it outright. He said he'd need to check with a supervisor and motioned for Chuck to take a seat. Chuck nodded and stepped aside, finding a bench near the east-facing window. He sat slowly, one hand still resting on the folder. His posture was straight, not from pride, but from habit. He looked out the window without expression, the kind of look that isn't blank, but full of things unsaid. He wasn't here to demand anything. He wasn't here to challenge the system. He just wanted to donate a small piece of land for something that mattered. A training ground for young people. A place to teach discipline, respect, and survival skills. Things he feared were slipping through the cracks of a distracted world. A week earlier, he'd pitched the idea to a few town leaders. Nothing grand, just a space where kids could learn how to tie knots, build shelters, and learn to stand on their own feet. Some nodded politely. A few chuckled and said it sounded old-fashioned. But he saw something in one councilwoman's eyes that told him to keep going. That's why he came here today. He wasn't looking for applause. He wasn't expecting resistance either. After a few minutes, Kellen returned with a woman in her 50s, dark hair in a bun, sharp glasses. Her name tag read Deborah Whitmore, Deputy Administrator. She approached the bench and extended her hand, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She greeted Chuck by name and said she'd reviewed the file. She spoke with a tone that was both firm and overly polite, like someone who had practiced balancing courtesy with control. She told him, with measured words, that the records he had were no longer verifiable in the current system. Without digital confirmation or recent tax filings, the property could not be processed for reactivation. Chuck listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he asked if the handwritten coordinates on the original deed were still recognized. She said no, not unless he had proof from the land office. He opened the folder again and pulled out a photo. It was faded, black and white. It showed a younger Chuck standing beside a border post with coordinates carved into the stone behind him. His signature was in the corner. Deborah barely looked at it. She shook her head slowly, almost apologetically, and said it wasn't enough. Then she asked, lightly, what his connection was to the land. She smiled almost jokingly and said something like, "Were you a fireman or part of a ranger crew back then?" Chuck looked at her for a moment before responding, then said, almost like it was nothing, that he had been on a detail, a special unit. She laughed softly and said, "Like National Guard? Or one of those weekend warrior groups?" He didn't laugh. He just said he had been with something called Raven Sector, but she'd never heard of it. Deborah turned to Kellen and whispered something, then turned back and said they'd unfortunately have to deny the request. Too many gaps, too many unknowns. Chuck simply nodded. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't explain, he just closed the folder carefully and placed it back inside his canvas bag. She told him he was welcome to resubmit if he could gather more documentation. He thanked her and turned back toward the bench. Then he sat again, hands resting on his knees, eyes returning to the window. No one else in the building seemed to notice the exchange. Or maybe they noticed, but didn't care. He was just another old man with old papers and old ideas. What they didn't see, what they couldn't have known, was that the man they'd just brushed off had once operated deep inside territories so sensitive that most of the records were never digitized. They didn't know that the land he was trying to give back had once been the location of a covert defense installation, one that no longer appeared on any modern map. Chuck had never spoken publicly about it. He'd signed the silence into his bones a long time ago. But the promise he made to the men who trained with him there, many of whom never came home, was still alive. That promise lived in that folder, in that land, and in the quiet resolve of the man now sitting silently by the window. Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves danced across the sidewalk. The flag out front snapped once, then held still. Inside, Chuck reached into his coat and gently pressed his hand against something sewn into the lining. It was round, cool to the touch, and old. It was a coin, not currency, a token, flat black iron with no date, no number, no name, just a carved hook clasp, broken in half. No one in that office would have recognized it, but to the few who had ever earned one, it meant only one thing: finish what you start. And that's exactly what Chuck Norris intended to do, even if the world no longer remembered why. Deborah Whitmore was not the kind of woman who liked being caught off guard. She had worked her way up the town hall ladder for nearly 25 years, and if there was one thing she prided herself on, it was control. She liked systems, protocols, and predictability, the neatness of forms, the logic of approvals and denials, the security of clear lines and rules. So when Kellen had called her downstairs, saying some elderly man with a faded file was insisting on land access based on paper records from the Reagan era, she rolled her eyes before she even left her office. She walked into the main lobby with clipped steps, her heels clicking softly against the tile floor. She carried a tablet under one arm, but it was mostly for show. She had already checked the registry. Nothing came up under Charles Norris, not on parcel 17 or anywhere else in the last 40 years. She didn't expect to find much. Still, she offered him a polite smile as she approached the bench. Chuck stood as she neared. Old habits, maybe. Deborah extended her hand and he shook it with a grip that was firm but not aggressive. She introduced herself as deputy administrator, then thanked him for waiting. He nodded, just once, then quietly said he understood there was an issue. She motioned for them to step to the side, near a standing counter by the directory. It gave them privacy from the other clerks, but not from the view of the rest of the lobby. She opened the folder he'd brought and scanned it quickly. The paper was thick, almost parchment-like, with a grain that made her fingers itch. The print was typed, real typed, probably on a Smith Corona. She glanced up and asked lightly if this was a copy of the original. He said no, it was the original. Her brow lifted, not out of respect, but skepticism. She ran a fingertip along the notarized seal. The ink had bled into the paper over time, and the state emblem was a version she hadn't seen since college. She tapped the corner of the page and gave a short, amused breath. Then she asked in a voice that floated between teasing and condescending what Chuck had done back then. Was he in forestry? A fire crew? Maybe local land patrol? He looked like someone who had hauled logs or trained dogs in the woods. Chuck paused, just slightly before replying. He said he'd worked with a specialized unit under federal authorization involved in defense measures. Deborah tilted her head and smiled wider. That smile. It was gentle on the outside, but underneath it carried a sharpness like polished glass. The kind of smile that people in power use when they've already decided something isn't real. She said the words slowly, like she was tasting them. Federal authorization. Defense measures. Then asked, laughing, if that meant he was in one of those old experimental units. Maybe Black Ops. Her voice wasn't mocking, but her tone was unmistakable, like a teacher letting a child finish their story before correcting them. Chuck didn't respond. Not right away. He just looked at her, long enough for her smile to tighten at the corners. Then he quietly said that the land had been set aside under a classified program that, to his knowledge, had never been declassified. That the papers she held were the only link left to that promise. Deborah exhaled through her nose and tapped the tablet screen in her hand. She showed him the empty results page. No listing, no match, no activity. She said that unless he could produce a digital verification or recent tax record, there was nothing more she could do. The county land board wouldn't approve usage without official traceability. She thanked him again, this time with finality, and motioned to Kellen to note the closure in the file. Kellen, who had been lingering nearby, scribbled on a clipboard but avoided eye contact. Deborah looked back at Chuck and gave him one last line, soft as velvet and just as dismissive. She told him if he could find something more current, perhaps a title update or affidavit from a known agency, they'd be happy to reevaluate. Then she smiled again, the same smile. Chuck nodded, no protest, no frustration, just that same calm, almost too quiet. He reached over, lifted his folder gently, and returned to his bench. Deborah turned away and walked back toward the stairs. She didn't look back. Why would she? It was just paperwork, just another story, and to her, Chuck Norris was just another aging man chasing a memory. Chuck settled into his seat and set the folder in his lap. He didn't open it this time. He didn't need to. Every page was already written into him, every signature, every stamp, every name. He stared at the marble tile ahead of him and took a slow breath. People think age softens a man, that it rounds off the edges, dims the eyes, and makes you more patient. But that's not what time does. Not to a man like Chuck. Time doesn't soften, it clarifies. It burns away the things that don't matter, and what's left is only what you won't let go of. He had come here with one goal, a simple one: give something back, nothing more. He didn't come to argue, didn't come to remind anyone who he used to be, because that wasn't the point. The point was the land, and the kids who would stand on it someday. He glanced at the clerk's desk. Kellen had resumed typing. His fingers moved fast, but his eyes kept darting toward Chuck, unsure. There was something in the way Chuck had stood, in the way he hadn't pushed back. It unsettled Kellen, like watching someone who knew a fight was coming and still didn't flinch. Then someone laughed. Across the lobby, a woman in a plaid jacket, waiting in line for permit renewals, leaned to the man beside her and whispered something. They both glanced toward Chuck, then chuckled again. The man muttered under his breath something about old guys and conspiracy theories. Neither of them thought Chuck heard. But he did. He heard it all: the quiet dismissal, the rehearsed tones, the laughter. And still he didn't move. He just sat, eyes steady, hands folded over the folder that held more truth than any database ever would. Outside, a group of schoolchildren crossed the street under the guidance of their teacher. They laughed, bounced, kicked at leaves. One boy pointed to the flagpole and asked a question Chuck couldn't hear. The teacher smiled and nodded. Chuck watched them. Not long, just enough to remember why he'd walked through the front doors that morning. It wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about recognition. It was about what they would inherit and whether someone still cared enough to shape what that future would stand on. He shifted in his seat and reached into the inside pocket of his coat. The small coin was still there, cool, heavy, worn smooth around the edges. He didn't take it out. He didn't need to. Just the feel of it was enough to remind him of the men who gave it to him and the night they first made that promise. A field, a flare, a silence thicker than fear, and then a hand on his shoulder placing the coin into his palm and saying only one thing: for when they forget. Chuck had held on to that coin for almost 4 decades, not as a badge, not as proof, but as a reminder that silence is sometimes the price of doing the right thing. But every silence has its limit, and sometimes it only takes one moment for everything to change. He looked again at the hallway where Debra had disappeared. Then he turned toward the window and let the light wash over his face. Calm, still, present. They hadn't listened, they hadn't believed. Not yet. But they would. Hector Alvarez didn't expect much out of that morning. He wasn't scheduled to clean the town hall until late afternoon, but his cousin had called in sick, and the office needed someone to cover. Hector didn't mind. He liked the quiet hours, liked the stillness before the day grew noisy. He was in his late 60s, still strong in the arms and legs, but with a back that needed a few more minutes to stretch out each day. Most folks saw him as the janitor, the man who swept behind the desks and took out the bins. What they didn't know was that Hector had once served under a name that never made the papers, on a base that never appeared on a map. That life had been decades ago, so far back now that sometimes he wondered if it had even happened. But his knees remembered, so did his hands, and somewhere in his chest, that part of him still stood at attention when it needed to. He pushed open the back entrance of the town hall with his supply cart, humming quietly to himself. He liked being invisible in the early hours. People talked when they thought no one was listening. He had overheard council arguments, private jokes, even the occasional confession, all while wiping windows or polishing brass plaques. But today was different. The first thing that caught his eye was the man sitting near the window. He noticed the posture first. It wasn't slouched, like most folks that age. There was a balance to it, a kind of weight that didn't rely on muscle. Hector recognized that stillness, the kind that comes from years of knowing when to wait. He paused to grab a new bag liner from his cart, but his eyes drifted back to the man. and then he saw it. A flicker of light caught something near the man's coat pocket. It was just a glimpse, but Hector's breath caught. A coin. Black metal, small, not polished, not for show. It had a broken hook symbol stamped into it. Hector froze. It couldn't be. Not here, not now. He stepped away from the cart slowly, almost unsure of his own feet. He moved closer. Not staring, but observing the way a soldier does when something familiar suddenly feels impossible. He stood about 6 feet away, pretending to adjust the lobby rug, but his eyes locked on the coin again. There it was. No mistake. That coin belonged to only a handful of people, fewer now than ever. Hector had only seen one once in his life, and it hadn't been in his hand. It had been pressed into the palm of a dying man who had passed it to the one who saved them all. That night had lived in Hector's memory like a scar too deep to fade. Brighton Hollow, 1984. The blackout, the confusion, the orders to evacuate that never came, the warehouse wired with explosives, and then, from the darkness, one man had come in, silent, precise, efficient. He'd neutralized the threat before it had a name. No insignia, no orders read aloud, no explanation. And just before he left, as helicopters circled overhead and the wind kicked up dust that stung the eyes, that man had placed a coin into the hand of Hector's squad leader. For when they forget. That's what he said. Now, Hector looked at the man near the window, and though the lines on his face had deepened, the jaw was the same. So was the set of the shoulders. Hector stepped closer, quietly, and whispered just 5 words. "You came back for us." Chuck turned his head slightly. He didn't smile, just gave a slow nod. Hector felt his chest tighten. All those years, all that silence. And here he was, sitting in a public building being questioned by people who didn't know they owed him their lives. Hector lowered his voice and asked if anyone here knew. Chuck shook his head once, then said softly that the past doesn't ask for applause. It only waits for those who remember. Hector looked around the lobby. The clerk was still typing. The woman in plaid was back on her phone. No one else had noticed. He looked back at Chuck and asked if he could tell someone. Chuck paused, then said, "Not yet." He needed to see how people reacted to truth before he gave them more. Hector felt something shift inside him. Not rage, not pride, something deeper, a mix of sorrow and reverence. He offered Chuck his hand, not for a handshake, but as a gesture of recognition. Chuck clasped it once, then released it just as fast. They sat there for a few moments. 2 men. One passed. No words. Then Hector stood, straightened his back, and walked to the front desk. Kellen glanced up, surprised to see the janitor there. Hector asked if the land parcel request had been denied. Kellen said yes, politely but distracted. Hector leaned in slightly and told him to pull the file again. Kellen looked confused but followed the request. Hector pointed to the coordinates, asked if Kellen had compared them to the legacy overlays, the kind the engineers used before digitization. Kellen stammered that he hadn't. Hector told him to do it, then walked away before Kellen could ask more questions. Back by the bench, Chuck watched without expression. But inside, something flickered. Not hope, not yet, but the possibility of being seen. Epra returned from the stairwell just then, scanning the room. Her eyes landed on Chuck again, then on Hector. She frowned. Something about the energy had shifted. She didn't like not knowing why. She called Kellen over, and they whispered by the printer station. Kellen looked uncertain. He pointed to the folder. Devereaux's brow creased. Then she crossed her arms and marched back over to Chuck. She told him firmly that lingering in the lobby wouldn't change the policy, that without federal validation, even the most detailed paper records didn't carry authority anymore. Chuck listened calmly, then asked her, gently, if she'd ever considered that some authority was never meant to be stored on a server. She scoffed and said that everything needed a chain of custody, proof, evidence. That was how the system worked. Chuck looked up, not with defiance, but with something far older. He said that systems weren't built for the truth. They were built to manage what truth left behind. Debra didn't respond. She turned and walked back to her office, tension in every step. Hector sat down beside Chuck a moment later and said he had a contact who might still be in the old network, a former radio tech named Janice, now working in records out of county storage. Hector said he'd make a call. Chuck nodded but said one thing: if it puts her at risk, don't. Hector said nothing, but he pulled out his flip phone and stepped outside. Inside, Chuck folded the folder again, slowly, and rested his hands on top. He could feel the air changing, just slightly, like the moment before a storm when the leaves flip and the light turns pale. Someone had finally seen the coin. And once that happened, the silence wouldn't last much longer. It didn't take long for Hector to find the number. It had been nearly 20 years since he last called it, but his fingers remembered the pattern like it was carved into muscle. The phone rang 3 times before a quiet voice answered. No greeting, just a single word. Yes. Hector didn't explain much. He didn't need to. He said Chuck was here. Brighton Hollow, Town Hall. The line went silent for a long moment. Then the voice asked one question. Is he carrying the coin? Hector said yes. The voice gave no instructions, only another silence. Then it said, I'm coming. Back inside the lobby, time moved slow. Chuck hadn't changed position. He was still sitting with the same calm, same steady posture. People came and went. Most didn't notice him. A few glanced but quickly looked away. There was something in his stillness that made them feel like they were interrupting something sacred. Kellen was back at his desk, fidgeting more now than typing. Debra hadn't returned from upstairs. Hector stood near the hallway, pretending to mop a spot that didn't exist, eyes shifting toward the main door every few seconds. About 20 minutes passed before the first signal arrived. A nondescript black sedan pulled up along the curb. No markings, no tags. A woman stepped out. Grey slacks, blazer, Federal ID clipped low, almost hidden. She walked with purpose, but no rush. She entered through the side door without stopping at reception. Janice Keller had worked in the Department of Military Records for 34 years. She wasn't high-ranking. She didn't give speeches or hold briefings. But she was the kind of person people went to when they couldn't afford to get it wrong. She knew the paper trails that others forgot. She remembered the codes that never made it to the database. She had heard stories about the Raven sector, but only in whispers. It wasn't listed under Army, Navy, or Air Force. It wasn't even fully labeled in black budget reports. But she remembered one thing. A phrase on a decommissioning memo from 1985. It had only 5 words. Silent asset. Confirmed. Returned to dormancy. She had seen it once, never again, until today. She walked straight past the front desk. Kellen opened his mouth but said nothing. Hector stepped forward and nodded once. She met his eyes. He whispered that Chuck was sitting by the window. She didn't look right away. She walked slow, giving herself the time to make sure it was real. Then she saw him. Chuck didn't stand. He didn't speak. But he looked up at her, and that was enough. Janice reached into her blazer and pulled out a thin case. Inside was a folder. Red seal, worn edges. She handed it to Hector and said nothing. He nodded. She turned to Kellen and asked where the town land registry server was located. He pointed toward the basement archives. She told him to unlock it, now. He obeyed. Janice descended into the basement, and it felt like the temperature dropped 10 degrees. She flipped on the lights, revealing rows of filing cabinets and a few ancient terminals. At the far end, under a dust-covered plexiglass box, was a collection labeled Pre-Digital Archives 1970. She found the drawer marked Brighton Hollow. Then she stopped. Her breath caught for a moment. Right at the front was a folder labeled Parcel 17. No barcode, no sticker, just a single paper tab with faint pencil markings. She opened it slowly. There it was. The deed. The seal. The original grant form stamped with initials she hadn't seen in decades. On the bottom corner, almost hidden beneath the fold, was a signature. It wasn't Chuck's real name. It wasn't even a full name. Just 3 characters. Per. RS7. She took a picture, emailed it to herself, then locked the folder back in place. On her way out, she passed the old secure terminal, plugged in her master key, and entered the offline registry. The interface blinked to life. She typed the old coordinates, then added RS7. A green light blinked. Verified. Janice returned to the lobby with no ceremony. She walked to Chuck and said it softly. "It's confirmed." He looked at her, and for the first time that day his eyes softened. Not quite a smile, but a weight lifted. Callan stepped back, stunned. Hector stood straighter. Debra appeared again near the stairwell and froze when she saw Janice handing over the file. Janice walked past her without speaking. She didn't owe her an explanation. She walked out the door, back into the waiting sedan, and was gone within seconds. Debra stormed over, her voice sharp. "What was that? Who authorized this?" Hector stood in her path. He didn't speak, just held out the red folder. She grabbed it, opened it, and her face changed. Her confidence faltered. Her hands trembled. She looked at Chuck, then back at the pages. Then she turned to Callan and told him to update the record immediately. Chuck stood now, slowly, deliberately. He picked up his folder, slid it into his coat and adjusted his scarf. Then he looked at Debra and spoke clearly. Sometimes systems forget, but people should not. She didn't reply. The lobby had grown quiet again, not awkward quiet, reverent. Even the people waiting for permits seemed to sense something had happened. They watched him walk toward the door with a kind of curiosity that bordered on awe. Outside, the wind was stronger. Leaves spun in little circles across the pavement. Chuck paused by the flagpole, looked up once, then turned and disappeared down the sidewalk. He didn't need a plaque, didn't need a press release. All he needed was for the truth to stand, on paper and in memory. The call came through a line no one used anymore. It wasn't listed. It didn't route through a help desk. It bypassed voicemail, switchboards, even encryption. It was the kind of number that only a few people in the country still remembered. And fewer still would dare to dial it unless something mattered more than policy. Janice Keller hadn't spoken that 6-digit code out loud in over 20 years, but today her lips formed the syllables like a reflex. The moment the voice on the other end picked up, she said just 5 words. "Brighton Hollow. He's in the building." The silence that followed wasn't confusion, it was recognition. Then came the reply. A single measured instruction: do not let him leave. Janice ended the call without saying goodbye. She slid her badge into her jacket and turned back to the files, her pulse steady but her mind racing. Somewhere, someone who still carried weight had just heard Chuck Norris's name, and the gears of something long dormant had started turning again. Back at the town hall, nothing on the surface had changed. The hume of lights buzzed faintly overhead. Printers clattered in the distance, phones rang and were answered without urgency. But beneath the surface the room felt heavier, as if time itself had slowed to watch. Chuck hadn't moved. He remained by the window, fingers resting lightly on the top of his folder. Hector stood nearby, close enough to be ready, but not so close as to cause a scene. Kellen kept glancing between them, sensing a shift but not understanding it. Deborah hadn't returned since reviewing the folder. Maybe she was stalling. Maybe she was shaken. Then, without fanfare, the front door opened. No sirens, no badges flashed, just a quiet presence stepping across the threshold. The woman who entered wore civilian clothes, but her gait carried years of command. She was tall, mid-50s, silver streaks at her temples. Her eyes were the kind that scanned a room before saying a word. She carried a briefcase in one hand, closed tight with military-grade clasps. She didn't look at anyone except Chuck. When she reached him, she stopped. Not a word passed between them. She simply placed the briefcase on the table beside his seat and tapped the latch twice. Chuck opened it slowly. Inside was a single leather-bound folder. Black cover, no title. Beneath it, nested in foam, was an object no one else in the room could see clearly, but Chuck knew it by feel. A field-issued confirmation token, cold as slate and engraved only with a serial. RS 7403. He turned to the woman and asked quietly if this was official. She nodded, then said it was time. He stood, finally. The weight of the day seemed to rise with him. People around the lobby began to notice, not because of anything dramatic, but because silence is loud when it starts spreading. Kellen stood up without realizing it. The couple by the coffee machine stopped speaking. Even Deborah, now returning from the stairwell, halted in place. Chuck reached into his coat and handed Janice the original folder. Then he lifted the briefcase, tucked it under his arm, and faced the center of the room. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low, not theatrical, not bitter, but it carried. You questioned the paper because it was old. That's fair. Time fades everything. He looked at Deborah now. But some things don't fade. Some things are buried, because they were never meant to be understood by people who weren't there. And that's not your fault. Deborah's face turned pale. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Chuck stepped forward. Just once. It was enough. I didn't come for glory. I didn't come to remind anyone of who I was. I came because I made a promise. And because the next generation deserves land, to train, to learn, to grow strong. If your system doesn't know who I am, that's not my concern. What matters is that I've kept my word. The silence in the room deepened. It wasn't awkward anymore. It wasn't confused. It was reverent. Janice walked to Kellen's desk and placed a certified verification code on the keyboard. She told him to input it now. Kellen hesitated, then obeyed. The screen blinked once. A window opened. A green checkmark appeared beside the old parcel number. Status: Legacy Asset Secure Authorized. He looked up, stunned. It's in the system now. Chuck turned to Hector and gave a single nod, then said softly, "Thank you for remembering." Hector's voice cracked when he replied, "Always." The woman who brought the briefcase handed Chuck a smaller envelope. She told him it was time to receive what had waited too long. Inside was a certificate, a letter, and a medal, one that had been created but never delivered. Chuck held it in his hands and said nothing. Clarence stepped forward now, slowly, like a man realizing how wrong he'd been. He opened his mouth to apologize, but Chuck raised a hand. "It's all right. Some lessons stay better when they're earned." Deborah lowered her eyes. She didn't speak again. Chuck turned toward the doors. As he walked, the room stood still. Not frozen, but intentional, like everyone present had agreed, without a word, that they were in the presence of something rare, something forgotten, now remembered. He stepped into the light of day, the wind brushing his coat, and didn't look back. He didn't need to. Inside, Kellen stood behind the desk, staring at the screen that now held the record he said didn't exist. Janice had already gone. The woman with the briefcase had disappeared just as quietly as she'd come. Deba retreated to her office, where no one followed. And in the stillness that followed, Hector walked over to the wall near the receptionist's desk. An old cork board held outdated flyers, community bulletins and announcements from last season. He took one pin out, then another. Cleared space. Then he placed a folded paper in the center. It read only this: Parcel 17, legacy secured, in honor of the man who waited silently so that others could stand. And for the first time in years, Brighton Hollow Town Hall stayed quiet long after the doors closed. The wind had shifted by late afternoon. It wasn't harsh, but it carried a chill that reminded the town of the season's quiet transition. Trees along Main Street rustled with dry leaves, and the last of the sun cast long shadows across the front steps of Brighton Hollow's Town Hall. The building sat calm on its foundation, but inside something had changed, and though it couldn't be seen, it was felt. Chuck Norris was gone. He had walked out without a word of triumph, leaving only that quiet ripple of presence behind. Yet no one who had been in the room could return to their routine as if nothing had happened. There are moments that don't shout but settle in the bones. Moments that feel like the air itself stood at attention. That had been one of them. Kellen stood near the front desk, his hand still resting on the keyboard. He hadn't moved since confirming the legacy status of Parcel 17. It was there now, blinking green on the screen like a beacon in the dark. A record that supposedly didn't exist, suddenly illuminating everything that had been ignored. Hector remained by the bulletin board, adjusting the paper he had pinned there only moments ago. It wasn't official. It didn't need to be. The simple words were enough. Parcel 17, legacy secured, in honor of the man who waited silently so that others could stand. Deborah hadn't returned from her office since the walkout. Behind the glass door, her silhouette remained still for a long time before finally disappearing from view. Maybe she was reflecting. Maybe she wasn't ready to face what the silence had revealed. In either case, no one knocked. Then, as the lobby began to settle into that late-day lull, the front doors opened again. Not rushed, not forceful, but with purpose. A man in uniform stepped inside. Dark blue, chest full of decorations, a general's bars on his collar. His shoes clicked on the tile like punctuation marks. His eyes scanned the room and landed on Hector. He nodded once, then approached the front desk. Kellan straightened. He hadn't seen the man before, but the presence was unmistakable. Someone used to command, someone used to action. The kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to be obeyed. The general said he was looking for Mr. Norris. Hector answered before Kellan could speak. He said Chuck had been here earlier, but he was gone now. The general didn't seem surprised. He asked if the property had been verified. Kellan stammered, then nodded, showed the screen. The general studied it for just a second, then looked back toward the room. His tone shifted, lowered, and then, in a voice meant to carry but not echo, he asked one question. Who here called him a fraud? The room stopped. Not a paper rustled, not a breath was drawn. Hector looked down. Kellan swallowed but said nothing. Even the woman waiting by the license counter took a step back. No one spoke. The general waited, let the silence do its work. Then he walked slowly to the center of the room and faced the bulletin board. He read the note Hector had placed, then took a deep breath. His shoulders squared, but his hands were relaxed. When he turned around, he wasn't angry. He was solemn. He spoke, not like a man reprimanding a room, but like someone delivering a eulogy. That man you dismissed helped secure the safety of 3 towns in 1984 during a covert operation never listed in public record. The training base he protected didn't just guard weapons, it protected the minds and futures of those who would lead later. He served without recognition, by design, because some missions only exist when they are invisible. He paused to let the weight of it land. The coin he carried is given only to those who finish their mission without leaving a footprint, no ceremony, no medal, just one promise, and one reminder that if ever they are questioned, silence will speak for them. Hector felt his throat tighten. He remembered that night like it was yesterday. The general turned to Kellen. You doubted him, not because of malice, because of ignorance, and that's forgivable. But only if you learn. Kellen lowered his head. He had nothing to say. Nothing would have been enough. The general took a sealed envelope from his coat and placed it on the desk. That's for him. When he's ready. Then he turned to go, but not before glancing once at the board again. He read the final line under his breath. The man who waited silently. Then he nodded and walked out. Nobody moved for several minutes. The silence that remained wasn't heavy. It was honest. It held the room upright. Later that evening, after the building had emptied and the streetlights buzzed to life, Hector stood in the parking lot behind the town hall. His truck keys jingled in his hand, but he hadn't opened the door yet. He looked out toward the hills past the tree line, where Parcel 17 sat untouched. He thought of what it would soon become. A place to train, to build, to learn what isn't taught in books. A place not just of memory, but of motion. As he stood there, a car pulled up behind him. It was old but clean. The engine idled low, the window rolled down, and Chuck was in the driver's seat. No words, just a look. Hector smiled. Chuck reached across and held out the envelope the general had left. Hector took it, opened it slowly, and found a single page. It was a certificate, unsigned, blank but bordered in gold. Across the top it read only this: honor recognized by those who remember. And underneath, in handwriting that was firm but faded, was a note. It said, for every time you stayed silent so others could speak, for every time you walked away so others could stand, thank you for finishing what we started. Hector closed the envelope and handed it back. Chuck didn't speak. He just nodded once, then drove off into the quiet that waited. And Brighton Hollow was never quite the same again. A week after the briefcase had been delivered, after the coin had been seen, and after the silence had done its work, a new sign appeared at the edge of Brighton Hollow's Civic Park. It wasn't flashy. No ribbon cutting, no officials in suits or kids waving flags. Just a plank of clean cedar, sanded smooth, standing upright in the earth. Engraved into its surface were 9 words. Chuck Norris. He stood when no one else saw why. There were no dates, no summary, no explanation, just those words. People noticed it gradually. A jogger slowed down to read it, tilted his head, and kept moving. A mother pushing a stroller paused long enough to run her fingers over the letters. A veteran in a windbreaker stood still, his eyes narrowing with recognition. No one asked who put the sign there. No one needed to. The town knew. Parcel 17 had been cleared by then. The brush was gone, the old fence posts pulled and stacked. A new gravel path traced the perimeter, not for decoration, but for purpose. It led to a shaded circle of level ground, marked by nothing except its stillness. That space was reserved. Waiting. Chuck never attended the public meeting that followed. He didn't have to. The town council voted 7-0 to allocate the land as a youth development and training ground, not a monument, not a park, a place to learn how to carry weight without dropping it, to lead without shouting, to serve without expecting. They named it the Northridge Field. That's all. No surname, no title. But again, people knew. It began quietly. A few teens from the local high school came out one Saturday morning, guided by a retired Marine named Wyatt. He set up a temporary shade tarp, taught them how to pitch it low against the wind. They learned how to read a compass, how to tie knots that didn't slip, how to make a fire without destroying the soil beneath it. They came back the next weekend, and the next. Soon the sheriff's nephew joined, then 2 kids from the shelter on Birch Lane, then a boy who hadn't spoken in 3 months, but suddenly asked how to sharpen a blade. Wyatt never said much about where the field came from. When asked, he only said it was made possible by someone who didn't believe in wasting time on speeches. Hector showed up now and then. He didn't train anyone, just brought water, watched from the edge. One afternoon, he told Wyatt that Chuck had dropped off a box at his house. Inside were laminated field manuals, some weather gear, and a handwritten list of core values. There were no names on the papers, just bold headings. Finish what you start, know the ground you stand on, make silence mean something. A few months later, a new plaque was added beside the cedar sign. It was simple too, a flat stone pressed into the soil. The words weren't for the public. They were for the kids. Some people earn medals, others earn ground. Walk it with respect. Chuck didn't return to town hall. He didn't speak to reporters, though a few tried. He wasn't seen much at all. But his presence lingered. In the way people walked a little straighter past the clerk's desk. In the way Deborah's voice softened when she explained procedures now. In the way Kellen started double-checking files instead of assuming they were wrong. Even the mailman who once scoffed at the idea of secret missions in small towns began pausing at the board to read the notes pinned up each week. Notes left by kids. Things they'd learned. Things they hoped. Some were just drawings. One was a map of the field, carefully labeled with cardinal directions and the words, "This is where we stand tall." Hector said he never saw Chuck cry, not once. But one night, when he drove up to the edge of the clearing and parked under the trees, he noticed Chuck already there, sitting on a folding chair, wrapped in a blanket. No lights, just the sound of crickets and the low rustle of leaves. He didn't speak when Hector approached, just nodded toward the field. They sat for a long time. The stars above were clear that night. Orion hung heavy above the pines. After what must have been an hour, Chuck finally spoke. They don't need to know everything, just enough to keep it alive. Hector didn't ask what he meant. He didn't have to. Some truths don't need full names. They live in the shape of how you carry yourself, in the silence that follows your steps, in the way others adjust, without knowing why, when you enter a room. That was Chuck's legacy. Not carved into marble, but pressed into the routines of those who came after. When Chuck passed, it wasn't public. It wasn't sudden either. Just a note left on Hector's porch one morning. It said, "Thank you," and in the envelope was the black iron coin. The hook broken, same as always. Hector didn't cry then, not until a few weeks later, when a new boy showed up at the field and asked where he could learn to be like the man on the sign. Hector smiled and pointed to the trailhead. "Start with your boots on, the rest will come." The field still stands today. It's not on tourist maps. It doesn't need to be. But if you ever find yourself walking that gravel path and you feel a stillness settle over you, you'll know. You've stepped onto ground held together by a promise, a quiet one, but stronger than most.